and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Donald Trump has outlined his national security strategy that labels China and Russia as rivals. Does this document offer some insight into U.S. President's unpredictable foreign policy? I speak to Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from the Chinese Ministry of National Defense, who discusses China's rising global leadership in the area of peacekeeping. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei. We begin with U.S. President Donald Trump's national security strategy. The document is the first of its kind since Trump took office in January. It lists protecting the homeland, promoting American prosperity, preserving peace through strength, and advancing American influence as foreign policy goals. The document shows how his America First agenda fits his foreign policy doctrine.
U.S. President Donald Trump unveiling his America First foreign policy Monday, framing it as a new era of global competition.
We accept that vigorous military, economic, and political contests are now playing out all around the world.
Trump's national security strategy labels Russia and China revisionist powers, seeking to challenge American influence, values, and wealth. The administration writes, quote, Russia aims to weaken U.S. influence in the world and divide us from our allies and partners. At the same time, Trump publicly cited Washington and Moscow's recent intelligence cooperation that prevented a bomb plot in St. Petersburg. The document also mentions the threat from Beijing more often than any other nation in the world. Quote, competitors such as China steal U.S. intellectual property. China gathers and exploits data on an unrivaled scale. Beijing counters that its economic rise has benefited the world and created millions of American jobs.
China has opened up a road of cooperation and win-win that brings benefit to the world while seeing to China's own development. This has been widely recognized by the international community.
But the Trump administration wants to increase trade enforcement, address trade imbalances, and protect its research and development centers. The document calls for tougher national security reviews of foreign direct investment and even restricting visas for foreign-born science, math, and technology students.
Economic vitality, growth, and prosperity at home is absolutely necessary for American power and influence abroad. Any nation that trades away its prosperity for security will end up losing both.
Trump's national security strategy also calls jihadist terrorist organizations the most dangerous terrorist threat to the nation. But he said U.S. allies share responsibility in the fight against terrorism, like the joint Saudi-U.S. Global Center for Combating Extremist Ideology.
For more on Trump's first national security strategy, we're joined in our Beijing studio Yang Xiyu, who is a senior research fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Ms. Sharon Squassoni, director and senior fellow from the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to start with you, Ms. Squassoni. Your reaction to this whole book of the national security strategy by the Trump administration, and as well as his words before that strategy was being totally published.
Well, the Trump administration has gotten out this strategy in record time, and unfortunately, I think they may have missed some nuance. This is not, the broad outlines of this strategy are very similar to those from previous presidents, but it's really in the tone and nuance where there's a difference. There's some very aggressive language in there, but when you step back, I think there's likely to be a mismatch between some of the policies in there and what actually happens. So, you know, in some respects, we'll have to wait and see. It has certainly caught the attention, though, of, for example, President Putin and Chinese officials as well.
Well, some mismatch, that is the word used by Mrs. Guasoni when it comes to the nature of this document and the actions and the rhetorics during the ordinary days of the Trump administration. Mr. Yang, do you agree with that?
Well, partly. On one hand, I agree with the point to say there's always a gap between the report, written wordings, and the real policies. Always the difference. Because the report is the so-called guideline for the midterm, at least, policy trend. And the daily affairs guided by the real policies is another matter.
One of the things that we need to mention is about the disconnect, apparently, between President Trump's rhetorics and words, as well as his interactions with the Chinese side during his last trip to China, and later going back to Washington, D.C. And the way China was being described in this national security strategy. In it, China is being described as the rival. And yet, when President Trump came to China, he was talking about partnership. So, Mr. Yang, how do you read the disconnect between these two very different versions, one would say?
Well, basically, I think there are two reasons. One reason is as I mentioned, the gap between the policy guidance and the real policy. In the written policy documents, like the report, the strategy, national security strategy, they have set up the description or definition about China-U.S. relation, the nature of the China-U.S. relation as a rival relationship. But in the daily affairs, whenever he met his counterparts in China, or the government meets the Chinese government, they have to face the challenges, opportunities. Challenge means the rival, but the opportunity means a real chances for cooperation. So we have seen the different disconnection of differences.
Well, yes, indeed, but what does that mean? Let's go to, on the phone in Washington, D.C., Douglas Paul, Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Mr. Paul, I don't know whether you are appalled by the way that President Trump in the national security strategy described China more than any other country as the rival, time and again.
Yeah, 23 times China is mentioned negatively in the report. And it seems to be trying to marry up the institutional aspects of foreign policy management with the campaign rhetoric that was used against China during last year's election.
Interesting. You're talking about the election time. It is the election time because the midterm election is coming. So many wonder, Mrs. Guasoni, in Washington, D.C. also, whether this is a strategic national security paper or actually this is a campaign paper that he's putting out in order to win more votes.
I'm not so sure it's a campaign paper. I think a lot of the public opinion for the midterm elections is going to hinge less on national security than on health care, tax reform, things like that. I do think it's a really interesting reflection of the real gap between Trump and his campaign rhetoric and his personal style and how the government actually works. So there's some very strong language in there about Russia and China, and yet on a day-to-day basis we do need to cooperate with China and Russia on a host of different issues. And yes, there will be friction and tension in relationships, but overall you make it work because you have to make it work.
You have to make it work. That seems to be like a reluctant choice. But once you get these words out, I wonder whether you can have it work. Because when you have some kinds of competition between China and the United States on different fronts, that's one thing. But when you describe another country literally as the rival in the national security strategy paper, that's totally of a very different nature. In that regard, Mr. Yang, I want you to come in. How would China react to this, and how should China react to this?
Well, frankly speaking, China has been used to facing such a declaration or definition about the commutation of the China-U.S. relation. During the past 2 decades, actually, there hasn't been a convincing conclusion about the definition of the U.S.-China relation from Clinton administration up to Obama and the Trump administration. That's not because the writer of the report is not smart, simply because U.S.-China relation has been in transition. We haven't completed the transitional period. Before the conclusion of the transition, we cannot have a clear, convincing conclusion of the nature of U.S.-China relation.
All right. That's interesting because you have just argued this is the fluid time. So a lot of words could be used, but some words you have to be very careful in using, I have to say.
Yeah.
And Mr. Yang, let's go to Mr. Paul. What would you say, Mr. Paul, about that?
Well, I think that the administration wants to convey a notion to the public in the U.S. that it's taking action. You know, I look at this national security report, and I see it as a cup that's half full and a cup that's half empty. The half full part is that there are elements in it that contradict the force of the direction of the Trump administration's policy. Talk about reform of international trade institutions, use of diplomacy, strength of alliances. These are all things that Trump has cast doubt upon in his actions. And at the same time, he dwells on revisionism, makes Russia a much bigger threat politically than anybody would normally see it to be, and has characterized China as trying to take over the world. And this is the cup half empty for me. It's a real mix match. Now, the interesting thing to remember about these reports is they tend to disappear within about 24 hours.
Really?
They don't have much shelf life and much influence on foreign policy.
One of the things that the Chinese side have responded so far, Chinese government Tuesday criticized U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to label Beijing as a strategic rival and also call on Washington to accept China's rise. The Chinese embassy in Washington put out this, quote, "It is completely egotistical for any nation to put its interests above the common interests of the other nations and the international community. It will lead to a path of self-isolation," end of quote. But the thing is, let me go to you, Mr. Yang, that once this is out, what it would be like for the Chinese side to work with the American side, and the American side in whatever areas could you take advantage of this so-called strategy describing China as a rival for their own interests? So things are likely to go to the extreme in a very easy way compared to what it is now.
Well, when U.S. part define the U.S.-China relation as a rival one, China has to make a response by adjusting our policy towards U.S.
Like what?
Like strengthen our capability to compete with U.S., although we hate to see the competition with the United States. But on the other hand, we firmly believe the cooperation benefits the most to Chinese national interests. Confrontation, competition, strategic competition will damage China's national interests, meanwhile damage the other ones. So basically, we will insist on the so-called two-hand strategy. On one hand, we will firmly respond any negative competition from the United States. We will never retreat. But on the other hand, we will try our effort to explore every opportunity for cooperation.
But you know, when you talk about cooperation, Mr. Paul, you know this better than probably anybody else. You've been working for the Republican administrations for several decades. You think about that. Even in the Democratic administration, President Obama, the two sides, China and the United States, not only have the bilateral chances to work together, but also, very importantly, on the multilateral platforms. The climate change issue is one, health issue, and also about even cybersecurity. The two sides were in meetings talking and discussing about this. But now, with the Trump administration, they very much look at only bilateral and denying any future of working together on multilateral platforms. So it seems that the chance of working together and the options are very limited, Mr. Paul. What can China do?
Well, I think China should pursue its own interests. The things that are attributed to China as being positive in recent days by the Trump administration are things China was would do for its own interest anyway. It did not vote sanctions on North Korea as a favor to the U.S., but because North Korea is posing challenges to Chinese security. And similarly on climate change. China has an interest in working on climate change for the health of its own citizens. And so I think just pursue China's interests, and there will be coincidence with American interests from time to time, and with good policy more often than not. But right now I wouldn't keep my hopes up for much cooperation from Washington.
Got it. What about the North Korea issue? Mrs. Guasoni, you've been working hard on that for several decades, and do you think after this so-called national security strategy with the wording of describing China as the rival out, will there be a spirit of cooperation in any further way between Washington and Beijing?
Oh, I think this Trump administration knows that it needs China's cooperation on North Korea. You know, this policy of maximum pressure and engagement. I like to joke that it's maximum pressure on North Korea and engagement with China. The U.S. can't avoid engaging China, Japan, South Korea, and even Russia, right? Because Russia and China are two key components of the effort to place pressure on North Korea. I think we're going to see that. Unfortunately, you know, the pronouncements recently from within the administration send conflicting messages, right? Secretary of State Tillerson is out there saying, we need to talk without any preconditions. The White House comes back and says, no, he's wrong. You know, this administration is tying its hands. So maybe it is time for China to step up and see if it can push the freeze for freeze solution, maybe put some incentives in there for North Korea to come to the table.
Mr. Flum? Mr. Paul, what do you think about President Trump's proposal earlier, working with China, but now, you know, we don't see much hope when this strategy is out?
Well, I'm afraid I'm a pessimist on the near-term outlook. The administration is signaling its preparation to take a number of adverse steps on Chinese trade and investment practices, maybe even on banking in the United States. And so I think we're going to see nothing but negative news in that area, and the administration will be in a position then to say they're surprised that there are problems elsewhere in the relationship when they're just trying to address trade and economic issues. And that's part of the lessons that are going to have to be learned by this administration or by the voters before the next presidential election, so they can decide whether this administration needs to be replaced or not.
All right. But, Mr. Paul, you know, there's one genuine question, that is, when the relationship between China and the United States is going down, who is going to benefit from that? It seems that nobody's going to benefit, really, from that. And therefore, people are wondering why Washington, at this critical juncture, trying to at least say what is said in the National Security Strategy paper. Mr. Paul.
There are lots of contradictions in American policy under Mr. Trump. He wants to tackle trade deficits on a bilateral basis when all economic experience suggests that deficits in trade are caused by domestic policy preferences, and they're universal, not bilateral in nature. I mean, you can address certain small problems in every bilateral relationship, but you don't solve deficits that way. You have to have more effective macroeconomic policies. Moreover, the stimulus proposals of the administration for the American economy directly contradict the goal of reducing deficits over the time of Trump's time in office. And so this is just a few examples of many contradictions, most of which I think can be explained by the hunger to show the voters that the contradictory promises made during the campaign period in 2016 are now going to be kept by this president.
Very interesting. Mr. Yang, you heard from our two panelists coming from the United States, different think tanks, certainly, but very similar idea in the way that they are saying, almost indirectly, that this is not going to hurt China, but rather this is going to give China a better chance to rise and also to take care of its own interests and work with some of the other partners. It seems that what they're suggesting is pretty much to this point, Mr. Yang.
Well, I think the reason or contradiction phenomenon in Washington, D.C. lies in the so-called tradition of the political correctness. It's always like this. Whenever some people criticize China, that always contains some risks. Whenever, no risk, benefits. Whenever some people say something objectively about China, even praise China, they always contain some risks. So even under Trump administration, such a political tradition has been changed. That's why, on one hand, national interests cannot be benefited by criticizing, but also, but on the other hand, political correctness require the criticism of
Putting
China.
political correctness aside, very early next year, likely there's going to be some trade issues between China and the United States, while the U.S. is now doing so-called investigation against China's trade policy and trade practices. So some pragmatic response and reaction from China, you would suggest, Mr. Yang?
Yes, I think China will try to solve the trade imbalance through the way of making pies bigger. In the dynamics, in expanding pies, we can make a rebalance of the trade between the two. But the U.S. approach is just recut the pie. That will damage both of the sides. So I think there will be a sophisticated game between China and the U.S. on how to rebalance the trade relation, the situation.
At the same time, China certainly is going to work even harder on the multilateral platforms while trying to seek a better relationship with the United States if the other side is cooperating. Of course, it takes two to tango. Thank you so much for the three of you for being with us on this critical issue. Yang Xiyu, Sharon Scossony, and last but certainly not least, Douglas Paul. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, I speak to Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from the Chinese Ministry of National Defense, who discusses UN peacekeeping as a component of China's global responsibility. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. The People's Republic of China has sent the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, to various hotspots as part of China's role as a prominent member of the United Nations. The PLA units deployed to peacekeeping operations in Africa and the Middle East include engineers, logistical personnel, and members of a paramilitary People's Armed Police. These men and women are testament to China's leading role in the multilateral system and global affairs. They are working as part of the UN peacekeepers.
The call to action can come at any time. There's an unannounced drill every week. Their rapid response exercise is to prepare troops for any possible scenario. This is the daily life of UN peacekeepers. Protecting civilians and impartiality are the core principles. Participating in UN-led peacekeeping missions since 1990, China has made a series of historic leaps in its peacekeeping efforts. More than 30,000 officers and soldiers take part in more than 20 peacekeeping missions. In a significant move in 2015, China announced it would set up a permanent UN peacekeeping force of 8,000 troops and donate $100 million to the African Union.
Africa has the biggest peacekeeping needs. In the long run, the international community and the UN should support African countries in increasing their own capacity in keeping peace and stability so that African issues can be addressed in an African way.
Last year, 3 Chinese UN peacekeepers died on missions. But that did not deter China's participation in UN peacekeeping operations. Keeping peace, bringing hope, better life to people in need is every peacekeeper's aspiration.
The PLA will, as always, actively perform its responsibilities and obligations compatible with its international status and make positive contributions to the building of a community of shared future for mankind.
And we are joined now in our Beijing studio by Mr. Zhou Bo. He's a senior colonel at the Office of International Military Cooperation of the Ministry of National Defense. Senior Colonel Zhou, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking you, China seems to have very proactive attitude in doing peacekeeping around the world. Many wonder whether there's any hidden agenda behind this. For example, trying to implement its own strategic goals through the means of peacekeeping. Senior Colonel Zhou?
No, I don't think there is anything like a hidden agenda. First of all, you cannot have it hidden because to perform peacekeeping, you first of all have to have the consent of the parties, and then you have to have the UN mandate in which China, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has to make its own decision. So unless and until all these conditions are met, then you can only send out the troops. So talking about peacekeeping, of course, it serves China's purpose of playing a bigger role for its international responsibilities. So this is just in the sunshine. We are not selfish. This is open to all.
But is China trying to do PR campaigns through sending more peacekeepers around the world, influencing more countries in the world?
Well, you can take it as a PR, but this PR is just like a flag, a UN flag flying in the wind, because it's a good positive signal to the homeless and hopeless people that their lives are still taken care of by people, for example, from China. So we have nothing to hide.
Is China trying to take the place of the United States to be so-called the biggest power behind the peacekeeping missions around the world by the UN?
Well, talking about United States, it's interesting for me to compare because the United States so far is the largest financial contributor, accounting for 28% of the whole budget, while China stands about 10.2%. So financially speaking, the United States is much stronger. But if you compare the efforts, then it's a different story, because China right now has 2,509 people working around the world, while the United States only has 67 people working on peacekeeping. So it's not so black and white.
So you're saying China is making much more effort than the United States?
Well, not
because it's sending real people onto the ground.
Well, not necessarily, because the U.S. is also making its own contribution by training more African peacekeepers in Africa, for example, while China would train more peacekeepers back in China. So we have different approaches.
But what about the fact that China were selling weapons to some of the countries, and eventually these countries used the weapons sold by China to them on peacekeeping? So many wonder, is China, through peacekeeping, trying to sell its weapons to the other parts of the world in a legitimate name?
Well, first of all, we have to differentiate weapon from equipment, because a lot of developing countries actually can only afford to buy Chinese equipment. For example, like APC or like trucks and so on and so forth. So it's quite all right for them to use Chinese equipment. And the question is, how could China actually continue supporting these countries? Because these countries could use Chinese equipment, but after 2 or 3 years, what about necessary damages? What about maintenance?
Senior Colonel Zhou, I'm sure you remember even better than anybody else, 3 Chinese peacekeepers died during peacekeeping missions in Africa.
Yes.
And probably that is the deadliest casualties the other countries suffered so far, even though China is new in the mission. So here's a legitimate question. How is China, as a member of the Security Council Permanent 5, be able to protect and urge the United Nations to protect its peacekeepers being sent by the United Nations?
Well, this is such a good question, and I just can't find a simple and direct answer to this question. First of all, Chinese armed forces, of course, would have best care for its own soldiers. We feel so sad to have lost 3 soldiers within 60 days. Yeah, 1 in Mali and 2 in South Sudan.
Right.
But the question is, the UN is supposed to provide good intelligence and logistics supplies to our people. And the most difficult situation in South Sudan is actually the fighting parties. One is led by the president, another is led by the vice president. So how can peacekeepers, be able to maintain peace in a place where there is no peace at all? So you're not supposed, peacekeepers are supposed to observe the situation and keep peace. They're not supposed to fight against the government forces, right? If the government forces and rebels are fighting against each other, then it would really put the peacekeepers at great risk, and that is a danger.
Can China say no when the United Nations is asking those Chinese peacekeepers to go and do missions which are not necessarily going to be fulfilled? And also when there is, as China peacekeepers might know, enough logistic and also intelligence support?
China can say no, like any other countries, to any request from UN. The UN cannot make it obligational on you to go a definite place. So you have the choice. But China, being a responsible power, would like to show the great international responsibility. That is why we have even set up a standby force of 8,000 people. 8,000 people plus 2,509 people would make it more than 10,000.
Right.
That will become the largest peacekeeping force in the world. So we won't say no so easily to the United Nations.
But here is the thing. How can you make sure there's going to be enough logistic support? There's going to be enough intelligence support. Your people are dying. Your Chinese peacekeepers are dying on missions.
And not only Chinese people are dying, but many soldiers from many countries are dying. And these are the same questions asked to the United Nations.
Therefore, here is the thing, Senior Colonel Zhou. How much do we understand about the international peacekeeping mechanism? How well does that institution and system work? Are the parts of the system really correlates with one another, or they're going in very divergent directions? There's not much cooperation, which led to the deaths of the 3 Chinese peacekeepers.
Unfortunately, the answer is not so good, because UN, as it admitted itself, really has a lot to improve. Because, for example, the latest example is the UN is so ambitious to set up a 4,000 Vanguard Brigade. Vanguard Brigade is composed of elite force of all the countries who have volunteered. So the mission, number 1 priority, is to protect civilians. And when can you protect civilians best? That is when the situation is most dangerous, when the peacekeepers are best needed. That normally is the time when the situation is most dangerous. So that means by UN, the latest standard, within 40 days, around 40 days, you have to be there. Then how about food supply? How about water supply? How about logistics supply? And who are the enemies? And who are the innocent? So all these questions are really good questions which don't have answers.
So you mean at this point, Senior Colonel Zhou, those have been sent, the peacekeepers from around the world, they have to go to the ground and figure it out themselves?
Theoretically, intelligence is provided by the mission.
That's theoretically.
Yeah, because then the question is how good it is, Yeah, because the other question is whether the local government will cooperate with you or not. Some government just don't like peacekeepers. In this regard, how can they provide you good information?
Here comes to another question, which is important also to peacekeeping, not only for Chinese peacekeepers, but also others as well. The UN seems to have what they call the Christmas mandate. Just to explain to our viewers why they call it Christmas mandate, because during Christmas, everybody would have something that they want. They could have as many as possible. Here is the analogy for the UN. They would promise through peacekeeping forces and missions to do all these responsibilities that many say have much gone beyond the original purpose of peacekeeping. So under this circumstances, China is sending more peacekeepers to the rest of the world. China is contributing more to the UN system, and China is contributing more financially as well. Is that a smart thing to do, Senior Colonel Zhou?
Oh, that's such a good question, because Christmas tree means a Christmas mandate means it's just like a tree full of good wishes. So many things, so bright, so beautiful, but they're hardly practical.
Like what?
For example, the mission in Central Africa. Well, they have 11 different tasks, from protection civilians to disarm the combat, to observe the election, and so on and so forth. And this is how peacekeeping right now is, which is called second generation peacekeeping, because before the dissolution of Soviet Union, that was a so-called first generation peacekeeping. The task is very simple. You just go there with the consent of the parties to observe the ceasefire, and that is all. Right now there are so many things on the shoulder of the peacekeepers. They're just too much. They just can't do it. And right now China, by sending 850 soldiers to the Vanguard Brigade, means that China actually has invited the greatest danger to its greater responsibility associated with danger for its own peacekeepers.
Why is China doing that, though?
Because China wants to show that China is a responsible nation. Because China wants to project the image of peaceful rise. Because by helping the world, China can be rewarded, and China can make this world safer.
But the question is, the system has to be improved at the same time. So who is responsible for that? And is China capable, strong enough within the international system to push that from happening?
Well, this is what the UN actually is doing. UN is reviewing all the missions.
We know how much UN would spend when it comes to time on reviewing and revising and improvement and reform, because that has been proved with its track record. So here's the thing. Your people, your peacekeeper is on the ground. They are facing a danger. And they are facing the so-called Christmas mandate lists. And the question is, what are you going to do with the fate of your peacekeepers?
Well, I hope your good question could be heard by the senior officials sitting in New York, because these are really the toughest questions.
To what extent China, as the permanent five of the Security Council, be able to push that agenda?
Well, China definitely will work with other countries to push the agenda, because China right now is the second largest financial contributor. China doesn't want to either to waste money or to waste the life of its soldiers. So China has all rights to ask UN to make UN mandate practical and to make our soldiers safe.
Senior Colonel Zhou, you know how much the world is changing right now. As a result of these changes, crises would happen anywhere in the world, in places that had never happened before even. And therefore, it means the missions, if it is a Christmas mandate by the UN, is likely to increase dramatically for the demands of the peacekeepers. So we are facing some really daunting tasks.
But unfortunately, this is reality. But the answer is not like that, because President Trump actually has threatened to cut $1 billion US dollars for peacekeeping mission. Well, that would really make UN crumble, almost or cripple immediately, because how many people, you look at Syria, look at the Middle East, everybody understands how many people need peacekeeping. But right now, actually, the whole peacekeeping missions themselves are shrinking. Right now, we only have 15. By next year, we are going to have 14. It's good to examine all of them, but still, we must understand that the peacekeeping needs to be increased rather than reduced.
And also needs to be perfected when it comes to the system, how it works. Having said that, though, talking about peacekeeping, China considers it as an important tool to be able to fulfill its international missions and responsibilities, while at the same time to demonstrate its attitude with a future of a shared destiny with everybody. But Senior Colonel Zhou, here's the thing. China talk about working with the African unions, working with the European unions, even working with the United States when it comes to UN peacekeeping missions and trainings. But will real improvements in these relations happen as a result of cluster of cooperations?
Well, I think that is the only way forward, and I think all these countries actually want to have cooperation.
What do you mean that you say that it's the only way forward? That means you yourself also consider it as a very tiny little step forward.
Well, I mean, the cooperation is the only way forward, because we actually have been cooperating with the African Union and with African countries multilaterally and bilaterally over years. So most of the peacekeeping missions actually are found on African continent. So therefore, it is good for us to help these countries and organizations, bilaterally or multilaterally. With the EU has extensive cooperation with African countries, and they also want to have cooperation with China, like the EU's battle group and China's standing by force. Both of them are very strong, and our commanders have met in Mali. But why can't they go a step forward, as the EU have suggested, to come to discussion about how the standby force could cooperate? And China and the United States have talked about enhancing the third-party capabilities. Meaning African countries. Well, first of all, President Obama had an agreement with President Xi Jinping during G20 meeting in Hangzhou. This is one of the outcomes, and this was reiterated again during President Trump's visit to China. So hopefully something will be done in the near future. And the good thing about this kind of China-US cooperation in peacekeeping is not only beneficial toward African countries, it is also a healthy development of this most important relationship between China and the United States. It shows that China and the United States are not enemies. They can cooperate, at least sometimes.
Not only to themselves, but also to the rest of the world,
to
demonstrate that it's important. Senior Colonel Zhou from the Ministry of National Defense here in China, thank you so much, sir, for being with us. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night. Senior Colonel Zhou, thank you.